I'm Jenny Klochko. You're watching my podcast, the platform for guest stories beyond your daily newsfeed. Russian imperialism is the focus today because it's one of the main reasons why Russia invaded in Ukraine and Putin does what he does with the help of his soldiers. So, my guest today, Valeriya Korablyova, assistant professor, Department of Russian and East European Studies, and she's also the head of the research center Ukraine in a Changing Europe, Institute of International Studies, Faculty of Social Sciences, Charles University in Prague, Czechia. So, let's see what you think about Russian imperialism and its all aspects, which we're gonna discuss today, and let me know what you think in the comments below. Valeriya, hello, how are you today?
Thank you. Doing well, even if alarmed with some news all the time, but thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Valeriya, Russian imperialism, named by many guests of my podcast, that it's the main reason of this Russian aggression in Ukraine. And would you agree on that? And how do you feel it being in Prague? Seems like away, but still in Eastern Europe.
The imperial lens provides with important insights on what the stakes are in the ongoing war and what it is really about. So it's not an exhaustive explanation, but it's an important one. And importantly, if we're talking about my positionality, being a Ukrainian based in Prague, I an inborn sensitivity towards Russian imperialism. Somehow it's much easier to highlight this dimension to Czech people than to people further west.
Do you feel a lot of Russians present and Ukrainians since the begin invasion? And I'm just explaining what I'm referring to. When I was interviewing one of Ukrainian rock musicians here in London, and they were touring around Europe, and they said it's quite interesting. We used to have lots of Russian language in Prague, and now that's all sort of like disappeared. Are they hiding, or they switched into into English? Do you feel this presence of Russians or in Prague? Well, you think that.
Prague generally has a long-standing tradition of being an important hub for Slavic peoples to meet and engage sometimes in very intense discussions. And even if like referring back to the interwar period, here was one of the first embassies of, unfortunately, short-lived Ukraine's People's Republic, but also the white refugees from Russia were meeting here in the early 20th century, a century ago. So it's very much ongoing, and all these debates and sometimes conflicting initiatives. So definitely here we have these entangled historically defined sensitivities from the Czech side, Russian side, and Ukrainian side played out very vividly on the everyday basis. And the first part of your question was about like various strategies of Russians presenting themselves and rebranding their identity abroad. And I have encountered it in many places, not only the Czech Republic, but also I have studied some research of my colleagues about these like diverse strategies of Russian diaspora adjusting to the ongoing war. Well, some of them are trying to enforce their patriotism and their identification with the Russian states. Others are trying to escape in some professional identities, presenting themselves as, like I don't know, a bank clerk, not a Russian, like, or an IT specialist. Some of them hide behind regional dimensions to telling that I'm from Siberia or Tatarstan or whatever, or from Ural, and that should be like meaningfully different. And up to the blunt strategies of lying when some overtly Russian speaking present themselves that, oh, we're actually from Kazakhstan or Belarus, so we are Russophone, but we are not Russian, sort of trying to mitigate all the implications coming together with the Russian political identity. So that's quite interesting to observe the entire wide like palette of different strategies of public presentation. Yeah.
Wow. Used to be different. I remember meeting people in Germany and they would be in Uzbekistan or Tajikistan and they would say, oh, I'm Russian. And I would think, you don't look like Russian. You don't sound like Russian. Why would you identify? And it's like people in my age. Valeria, the war in Ukraine, it's not sort of
Just
made.
like quick.
Yeah.
If I can quickly follow up on that, because um, there are different, like two sides to this story. If we are talking about people like the previous waves of migration from the former Soviet Union to the West, especially to the United States, there was no separate box for an identity which would be coming from Eastern Europe but be not Russian. And some people were saying, oh, I'm Ukrainian, I'm Belarusian. And there was no recognition on the other side. So they, in a way, they were forced to adopt this label of being Russian, which was not coming from inside, but it was more about like the external perception. And here, this is sort of Western epistemic imperialism as it plays. Since we are talking today about imperialisms, you know, it's not only the aggressive war in Russian imperialism, but also cultural and epistemic imperialism of the West that fails to recognize small identities and minor identities. So if we look eastwards, it's only Russia or nothing else. So this is part of the story, and this legacy is still there. And it prevents our interpretations from being heard and understood.
So this war in Ukraine, it's not just a military, isn't it? It's battle for history and a battle against empire or for empire, depends what side of the front line you're looking for. Could you talk it more through and explain to those who are far from this cultural motion and mental motion, and sort of to sort of go through it and explain why is it sort of more for history, for empire, for identity?
Thank you. I think that's a crucial question in the context because there are two poles here, two major cognitive distortions in the interpretations, or rather misinterpretations of the Kremlin's agenda and objectives behind this large-scale war. One would be very pragmatic, trying to make it very rational, that it is about some specific matters like the lines or some specific territories or some specific conditions, sort of very pragmatic, in a way normalizing the war as the continuation of diplomacy with specific matters, but some bigger stakes are involved here. And the other one would be that it's like that Putin is awfully anachronistic and that he's like reconstructing old times and he's too much diving into history and he's missing the present. And although there are like some good arguments for both of these interpretations, but they're missing the core point that it's not even a battle over history, but the history is instrumentalized because it's very much a battle over the future. Because there is a strong underlying belief that history is written by winners. So it's not important how people perceive the ongoing war now. It's important what would be the interpretation when the war is over. And somehow who wins overrides the history with their own narrative. Moreover, it's not only about the right to define interpretations of history, sort of backwards and onwards, sort of define the past and define the future, but also define the rules of the game. And from this perspective, it's very much about the design of the international order. It is a fight for hegemony if we are involved in this IR vocabulary. So basically, who defines the norms? What is acceptable? What is unacceptable? And how different actors navigate these very murky waters of contemporary world. So I think that Putin plays a very nice trick here with IR realism, which is definitely very vocal as a sort of as a school of thought in international relations. That basically, yes, we have these idealistic liberals who talk about normativity all the time, but let's be realistic. And realistically, there are big guys, there are great powers, they have a lot of resources, and they can wage wars because they can. Because they have their so-called legitimate demands, because they have their quote-unquote spheres of influence, and we all want to be moral, but if we're being, again, quote unquote, realistic, we need to recognize that some people are allowed to do more than others, and some states are in a privileged position, right? And the Kremlin plays exactly with this belief because it turns it around. By daring to wage a war, overtly breaking the rules, by the same token, Russia established itself as a great power. It does not have the necessary resources, but making this move, it plays in the belief of big IR realists and big guys that it is something important to reckon with, right? So it is moved in the story sort of trying to establish itself or re-establish itself as a great power by breaking the rules. And if this claim for greatness and special position and privilege is recognized by big players on the world arena, then the rules are changed because somehow this precedent president sends like the new game with new rule set, sort of that now, if you want to be truly great, independent, to have true sovereignty, then you need to violate as many rules as possible and to ban as many small players as possible so that you secure your positionality domestically, that no one would intervene into your domestic politics. And this is kind of the vision that Putin puts on the table, and it's very far from my realism. And I think that it's one of unfortunate misconceptions, but it is like very constructivist or deconstructivist by that matter. So, and in this rendering, great powers are modern day empires, because that's exactly the imperial thinking is very hierarchical. It structures the world into big players and the minor actors no one cares about. So those who dictate the rules and those who abide by the rules. So there are no like mitigating mechanisms or ideas or institutions for that matter. No right for self-determination of peoples, no human rights, no other institutions or rules or internationally recognized instruments that can mitigate the distinction. So we recognize that the hierarchy is there. And the best thing you can do for yourself as a representative of a polity is to try to climb the ladder. And that means you need to devise weapons, you need to, if we accept that might makes right, then you channel all the resources into your military capacity. And as a style of international relations and international diplomacy is being as dire and is as provocative as possible, because by the same token, you improve your positionality in the world. So that's kind of, it's a very dark world order, which the Kremlin is promoting, because this is exactly the world order where they have better chances and opportunities to secure their power domestically, but also to secure better international positionality for Russia. So I think this is at stake. And this is a very specific rendering of imperialism. So it's not like recreating empire for the sake of empire or because of the fantasies of allegedly, of Putin as a young man who was like connecting his own identity with some like Russian greatness, which might be there somewhere lingering under the surface, but it's very much about the present and the future and the world order and the type of relations that could be established, validated, and accepted between different nation states.
But if we compare European colonialism, I mean French and British, with Russian colonialism, and I mean, on the surface, it looks like these countries, former empires, still have an ambition, but they are no empires anymore. And they were sort of going somewhere exotic, somewhere different, which by look, by culture, by mentality. Whereas with Putin, he's trying to prove that you are no different from us. And he's sort of like annulled Ukraine history, or who was first, Kiev Rus or Moscovia, all of those things. And it seems like these are differences, and they are even deeper, isn't it? But if we compare this European experience with empires and how they ended up with Russian.
Thank you. That's a hugely important question. And since I'm coming from post-colonial and decolonial studies, I've been engaged in those debates for quite a while now. And there is this hardcore approach that if it does not fit our vision of maritime European imperialism, from which Great Britain would be a primary example, then we simply cannot name it colonialism or imperialism. It's something different, find a new name for that. But then if we zoom into that, French imperialism and British imperialism are very different. If we start unpacking it and break through stereotypes and go into the rationale behind and different strategies and so on. So, for example, what is the primary resources that are extracted in the colonies? Would it be the economic mentality, the economic rationality? Is it done for profit? Or is it also done for other reasons? And if we look into French colonialism or some less advertised Italian colonialism, let's say, imperial strategies like in Africa, then it would be much murkier. And then we have also some political agendas. If we look, for instance, in the French strategies in Algeria most explicitly, which was perceived as core of France, not a colony, but also in other parts, in other French colonies, they were very much assimilative, unlike British ones. So it was about sort of teaching indigenous population into being French citizens. It was this sort of differentiated inclusion. So there is like a broad variety of different strategies there. And if we go like a bit like centuries back to Spanish and Portuguese colonialism in Latin America, then it would be even another twist. So I strongly believe that starting to unpack Russian colonialism in Eastern Europe provides us with new insights, and it shows like possible different dimensions of coloniality, that imperialism can operate with different strategies. But basically what it makes explicit, that every empire deploys always, let's say, a big toolkit of strategies from which we can choose three main boxes. That would be othering, which we have talked about a lot and which is usually associated, this sort of Orientalism and British strategies in India and so on and so forth. So trying to enforce the difference between the colonizer and the colonized, often to substantiate the civilizing mission because we are more culturally superior. You are different, but we can teach you civilization, so to speak, right? So the first box would be othering and distancing. The second one would be saming or assimilation. So we appropriate whatever valuable you have. It's very obvious in the economic sense that we take your natural resources, that we take human resources and we exploit the labor force, but also we take away cultural resources. Whatever you have developed, and we think that it might enrich us, and it's enough to go to the Museum of Vatican to see like how much of cultural appropriation was made there, but also sort of trying to unpack the cultural development, how much of European cultural legacy is indeed very much like transnational and much more global than we are used to think. So that would be like the second box of assimilation, which is very prominent in the Russian-Ukrainian case, of course. And that is why it seems to be very different. And then the third one would be extinction. Annihilation. So if you refuse to surrender, or if you are unwilling to give away your resources, you will be destroyed. Symbolically and even physically. Right? So those who disagree to killed. And that is often known, for example, about settler colonialism. If we think about settler colonialism, if we think about American colonialism, like people are coming and settling certain territories, claiming that they were empty, that they are discovering them, that they are populating them, sort of trying to pretend that there was no indigenous population before, they just came and settled there. But actually, physically, people are being killed in the process. And then symbolically, it was claimed that there was nothing worthy there anyway. Yes, and if we think about like Russian colonialism, as they pretend that like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan are like very fresh statelets, even not proper states, somehow ignoring these like centuries-long Persian legacies there, sort of pretending that, okay, it was not there, and if something was there, it's not worthy. So this kind of physical and symbolic extinction is also very important, how empires operate, creating space for themselves and homogenizing or sort of trying to impose their projects. Okay, so, and if we look at the Ukrainian case, certainly, or the Russian colonialism in other settings, because Ukraine is even more complicated, because I believe it was Yaroslav Hritsak who called it like Zonde colony, a very special colony. So even if we recognize Russian colonialism, we still need to put asterisks and to see a very special role in Ukraine in the Russian imperial project. So if we look here, then we see simultaneously this differentiated inclusion, how it's sort of assimilating you, but always put the stop that you could never be properly assimilated. You would always be a bit of like under Russian, even if you fully accept this hegemonic culture and you're trying to convert yourself fully culturally, like acculturate and linguistically integrate into this space, you would still have this, suspicious profile of being peripheral, South Russian and sort of under Russian, right? So you can never fully integrate. You can completely neglect and give up on your origin. and sort of and try to promote your own career and climb the ladder, the price would be to deny your Ukrainian origins, right, or whatever peripheral origin that would be. So that would be the case, this sort of combination of othering and saming, sort of distancing and assimilation, and then of course extinction. And here the most exemplary in the Ukrainian case would be the executed Renaissance and the Great Famine, when two major constituencies, right, the peasants and the intelligentsia, were just like physically destroyed in the late 20s and the 1930s. So all those tools were at play in the wake of Russian imperialism, and they are enacted again on the occupied territories. And we are watching it live, basically. So going back to your question, how Russian imperialism is specific, I would want to highlight several important points. Some of them are widely discussed, some are less so. So starting the first one, and you already alluded to it, it's not a maritime empire, it's a land empire. And what it means that there are no barriers, or there is no like natural geographic distance between the metropole and the colony, right? So, and when we have these blurred geographic lines between the core and the periphery, then it's much harder to distinguish, to identify clearly where the periphery is, and most importantly, where the core begins, who benefits from imperialism, because it has not only the geographical dimension, the cultural dimension, but also the social dimension, which was very prominent here. We're used to think that either we are accepting, like the social lens, the class struggle, or the national competition. But here they were also both. So the social dimension was very important. But then again, it's not only this little lack of geographical distance, it also overlaps with the lack of cultural distance. So there is no racial difference. And very often people from the so-called global South, they say like, it's not colonialism because it's white on white oppression. You can call it whatever, but it's not colonialism because there are no people of color involved. And so there is no like racial difference here. So how does it play out? And we need to consider that seriously, right? So all these sort of, it's kind of interesting because it is a clear case when there are no, again, quote unquote, natural distance, how this distance is created, constructed, and enforced by different markers. And here I'm thinking, for instance, about like Mykola Repchuk's article. He's playing with the famous book of Frantz Fanon, White Masks, Black Skin, and he talks about white masks and black language. And he says that like speaking Ukrainian or even having Ukrainian accent in Russian language could be this sort of pretext for discrimination and denigration in a way. So it's very interesting to see indeed how those differences and how these hierarchies are socially constructed and perpetuated. Okay, so I mentioned these like absent distance and blurred boundaries that make this interplay and intertwining cultural, linguistic, racial, and social factors playing out in a very complicated, indeed, very complex and complicated manner. So it's quite hard to disentangle, but I would argue it's very exciting and interesting to do so analytically, but also it has important political consequences. And then another topic which I think is not spoken about enough is that Russian imperialism is what I call in one of my articles, catching up imperialism. So in a way, historically, it arrives on the arena after British and French imperialism, and it's mimicking them, and it's going into their footsteps. So to put it bluntly, if Great Britain was building the huge empire largely for economic profits, then Russia was mimicking the hegemon to be for the sake of being great too, even if it's not necessarily like was economically profitable. So building the empire simply to be in the league of big guys who decide the future of the world. And then it creates a very specific mindset of ruling elites in Moscow or St. Petersburg or whatever, like incarnation of the Russian Empire we are talking about, always being resentful about catching up, always lagging behind, being sort of secondary, but at the same time legitimizing all the atrocities by like weird normativity that we were not the first. And anyway, everyone is doing that. And if you listen to Putin's speeches on the first day of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, he does not talk about Ukraine almost at all, with a very short mention of Donbass. And for 40 minutes, he talks about all the wrongdoings of the West. Instead of trying, not yet adopting the imperial language, it happened later, like half a year later, when the Blitzkrieg failed and the Kremlin decided to rebrand the war in the colonial terms, playing with the global South, trying to garner their sympathies quite successfully to a certain extent. But in the beginning, he was talking about the bombing of Yugoslavia in the 1990s, that the United States did it, violating the international regulations. So why shouldn't we? So this kind of trying to get certain legitimacy, even if it breaks the law, like literally, but then sort of trying to prove it that sort of in terms of practices, it is accepted by the global community. So this type of catching up imperialism is very important for understanding the mindset of the Russian elites. And I think that we need to keep it in mind as well, yes. Sorry for speaking for too long.
No. It's all very exciting, and I'm trying to not to forget, but I want to sort of like us to follow up. Would you agree that while Putin sort of like exercising the military power, the military sort of these tools and destroying physical lives, he's also enforcing, and it's actually started in 2014, enforcing decolonization of Ukraine internally and externally. For example, internally, yeah, we still have Russian speaking people in different sort of age groups. Yes, we do have Soviet minded people. Yes, it's still there, but we also have many newer fields, those who are from historically Russian speaking regions, or for example like Kharkiv or Suma, and those people sort of like, especially if they are coming from celebrities, I mean, they are the influence and they enforcing this Ukrainization, self-identity. And on outside, Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian history going through something which we could call like reclaiming, right? Like Repin, I mean, the artist, or Malevich, that's like in the top museums outside of Ukraine, and it's sort of like it's been corrected. It's born in Ukraine, or Ukrainian artist, or coming from Ukraine, and it's kind of like it seems from Russian point of view, from sort of those who closer to Kremlin, they are expanding, but it could be the last call to save themselves, because with this chaos, with these sort of like mess inside the country, that if they don't spread it, they sort of become overwhelming, and this beast, this monster eating itself, in many dimensions. Would you agree on that? The sort of like this enforced decolonization, and maybe some your own examples, if you agree on that, your own examples of these processes.
I find it fascinating. I find it fascinating the entire set of practices that we call decolonization, which is not always exactly about decolonization, but it is somehow like in reaction, in response to the Russian aggression inside Ukraine and outside of Ukraine. And that's fascinating. So I should tell you that, yes, you're right. It started like much before in 2014 and even earlier, but it acquired this mass recognition, certainly in the wake of the full-scale invasion. And I would say what I was surprised with, I would name like two major developments. The one would be this sort of educational and artistic activism, that this plea for decolonization, it did not come from the academic domain. Because whether you know it or not, but Ukrainian post-colonial and decolonial studies were actively developing like immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union, 1992, the seminal article of Marko Pavlishin. So people were talking about this sort of the post-colonial lens, how it is applicable to the like relationship between Russia and Ukraine. So it has been developing for decades, but it was like a niche interest for like a very small group of people. And then suddenly in 2022, many people adopt this language of decolonization because it is meaningful for them, but not from the academic perspective, but from somehow like existential perspective. Like I feel attacked, and then I'm trying to make sense of it. Like, why am I attacked? And then of course, if Putin instrumentalizes the imperial vocabulary to legitimize brutal invasion, then it invokes a sort of to disentangle all those matters, and like to make sense of them and to question alleged certainties. And you were referring to eastern and southern parts of Ukraine. And there, many people were socialized in a Russophone cultural sphere, and they were consuming to a huge extent media products coming from Russia. And they internalized many beliefs from there. And one of those beliefs, very efficiently implanted by the Kremlin propaganda, was that the main danger is Ukrainian nationalism. And Russia is a friendly country. And then suddenly, this sort of established system of coordinates for people crashed completely because your everyday experience, your daily evidence testifies otherwise. And then once, the certainties are shaken and people develop this curiosity and even hunger for historical facts, for cultural facts. And then I was surprised, like people in bomb shelters were asking like for public lectures, and they were asking historians, just like to tell about some historical developments, in the 16th and 17th century. And then they have some literary scholars who were like reciting the poets of the executed Renaissance, and all of those matters that were somehow like enforced in the like secondary school curriculum, and people were not necessarily always eager to learn all of that. And then suddenly they were asking for that. So at the brisk, facing the danger of death, they started caring about some symbolic metaphorical things. And these kind of, and then you have this like really boosting artistic production, which you would not necessarily connect with the needs, with the exigencies of wartime resistance. And I'm thinking about stand-up comedy, for instance, or some metaphorical, some theaters, new kinds of theaters and operas. And of course, some of them are reacting to like the Kakhovka Dam disaster, or, some like social and political resonance of certain events. But some of them are very metaphorical, playing trying to show the plot from Lesa Ukrainka book, or something like that. So this curiosity and cultural production, like incessant cultural production in the search of the self, I think that it was driven very much with like, searching for the self. Who am I as a person? What is my story? And what is the community where I belong? Right, and what it means, and people were rediscovering family histories, but also like national histories, and they were trying, and they were thinking themselves and their life strategies. So that was kind of this practical aspect of decolonization, which was this kind of more disentanglement from the Russian perspective, I would say. And that was not only in Ukraine kind of, you understand the context, but also it just boosted in Central Asia, in places like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and although the political developments there are not necessarily most conducive for such endeavors, but like this grassroots activism and educational activism, a lot of podcasts, and again, like all these activities and public lectures are there, but also even inside of Russia, people from faraway national regions that do not associate themselves with the center, they were also started thinking about their subjugation to the center, to Moscow, also in colonial terms, and what it means, and what is their legacy, and where is their language, and why are they missing their local histories. And sometimes it is presented in a serious manner. Sometimes it's about public histories, and sometimes again it's like stand-up comedies. There is this guy who is called Surovый Yakut, who is coming from Yakutia, and he's talking about basically colonial, like how his native land was brutally subordinated to Moscow, but in a very sort of in a comic, sarcastic manner, and it finds a very like a good audience, especially among the youngest people. So all this is happening in the region. But then if we look like outside of region, I think that it was like a double shock, a double surprise. So no one expected Russian full-scale invasion, largely in the West, but also no one expected Ukrainian resistance. Because within the imperial logic, you are weaker, you must surrender. And I think it was like articulated well by Donald Trump at this infamous meeting at the Oval Office, when he said, like, you have weak cards. You cannot bet, right? Because you do not have enough resources. In the world of big guys, you shut up and surrender. That's like what is expected from you. So in a way, it was like breaking the rules and expectations from both sides, from the aggressor and from the defending side, right? And then it started making sense to understand the root causes of this resistance and this resilience. That would be other like buzzwords for the Ukrainian miracle, right? For this phenomenon. And then there was this desire to quote unquote discover Ukraine, sort of to understand how it is different from Russia. It's not just like periphery of Russia, under Russia, but it has something different. Okay, so it makes sense to understand what it is all about, and we have a lot of like academic research, but also activism and cultural collaborations and very many productive projects of sort of discovery for themselves. But that's again, that's quite a colonial discovery because it has been there all the time, but the curiosity just emerged, you know. It used to be like a culturally empty land, academic maps too. And now we are discovering that. And that is called decolonization. Okay, so in these like broader Western context, decolonization is about pluralization. So it's about like, we still keep Russia in focus, but let's put one or two other players, polities, cultures on the map too, and try to study them. And Ukraine would be one of them. And that is called decolonization, especially in the context of East European studies.
Um, Many of sort of Russian liberal thinkers or voices, they say that basically Putin started this aggression against Ukraine to unite people, because in such huge country there are not many things can unite them, who is culturally, mentally, you know, historically, they are very different people. And they sort of like waging for small victorious war. He brought sort of like something which endangered its own empire. And while it's still very difficult on the battlefield, and recent interview with the head of Ukraine's defense intelligence, Budanov, and he was saying, disappearance of the country is a real thing. And it's not like we already passed through that stage. Country just disappear. And for example, Poland, it was for many years that such country wasn't sort of part, it didn't exist. So now they are strong part of NATO, blah, 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 but there are countries. So it might be a danger for Ukraine. But also, um, not being empire, it doesn't mean Russia dies. It can be still a nice, glorious future. So they don't have to stick to this empire. For example, Timothy Snyder, he was saying those former empires and not being empire worked well for them. Look at the EU. They are all happy, glorious, friendly, and lovingly and relaxed, and nobody is sort of trying to grab any territory. Do you think they're sort of like, I know it's difficult for me to ask you as a Ukrainian, and for you probably to answer as a Ukrainian about the positive or some nice future for Russia, for everything they do in Ukraine constantly, every day, but not be an empire. Just, you know, just be in different regions and concentrate on internal problems and like improving the quality of life rather than expanding the territory. What do you think about that?
Well, I would have several remarks. The first one that is important to mention is that empires changed internally, usually after defeat, not after victories. Because every time you win, it's a positive reinforcement that you are doing everything right. If your imperial endeavors are successful, then you are going on and continuing with even more imperial endeavors. And talking about the Russian history, every time it was trying to democratize internally, that was coming after a defeat in a big war. And for instance, like the defeat in the Russian-Japanese War in 1905 produced this desire to change something domestically. So once you lose, you are trying to do the homework and to understand maybe you should like better something, you should improve something domestically, and that might result in more autocratization or more democratization. Again, it's not a given. But in order to even make any change possible, a clear-cut defeat is needed. And I think this is the point made by Timothy Snyder and Applebaum and other maybe less known intellectuals drawing from history. That's usually how it happens. Going to the European history, and then again referring to the idea promoted by Snyder, which I find fascinating, is basically that the European Union was a safe landing after the defeat of empires. So when we are thinking about the mid-20th century, we are trained to think about the end of two world wars, and we are very much remaining Eurocentric and Western-centric, and we're thinking about all the atrocities and how allegedly, again, I think Snyder calls it the fable of a wise nation, that suddenly we came through the atrocities wiser, and now we collectively as Europeans decided not to wage wars any longer. But at the same time, weakened European states, weakened indeed in the wake of two world wars. Again, the monarchy world is like questionable here, but let's stop at that now. So in the wake of two world wars, big powers in Europe got weakened, and eventually they lost their overseas colonies. So if we think about the Bandon Conference and about like all the developments in the 1950s and 1960s, that was decolonization, but it was not like a willing decolonization. It was not about like good maritime empires letting go of their colonies, but they were weakened and in a way they lost this battle for their colonies. And then in this sort of indeed smart move of creativity, of geopolitical creativity, they created a union and they turned their attention inwards into the continent. And they decided to compensate. They lost the sources of income. They lost their huge geopolitical structure. And somehow they decided to pool their resources to be great together. So it was not like the perfect strategy, but it was a working one. So in a way, it's a good example of post-imperial transition. And that's the good side of it. So once you are pushed in a corner, you rethink yourself, you reestablish yourself, and sometimes you democratize it yourself. Say it is a polity designed very differently, and the structures of power itself is distributed differently there. So if we go back to Russia, and if we imagine some sort of post-imperial transition or post-imperial shift, then there needs to be some like bifurcation point, some like trigger event, and a defeat in the war, one way or another. It might be coming from the battlefield from Ukrainians. It might be coming from the consolidated response of the world community, not accepting this plea for domination simply because it violates the rules, enforcing the rules, the international rules, through like severe punishment, not just like, the facade punishment of the aggressor. That would be the point that, again, might result in democratization or autocratization. No one knows. And many people are scared. Because predictable aggressive Russia for many players abroad in the world, it's still a safer bet than unpredictable Russia after the defeat. And I think that's one of the stumbling blocks that impedes harsh reaction to Russian aggression.
Valeriya, for those who would like deeper to understand culturally Ukraine historically, is there any, and by the way, surprising for me, through the search for Ukrainian language, because I know many viewers among my audience, they learned Ukrainian inspired by different reasons. What would you recommend them to read or inquire, to research? Maybe some authors or the books would be useful for the English-speaking audience.
There are plenty. Indeed, it depends. It depends on the interests and on the taste of the material. So luckily, I think the good side of these unfortunate events in Ukraine connected to the Russian aggression is that now a lot of materials have been translated into English and are much more accessible on internet and otherwise. So if we're thinking about the history of Ukraine, many wonderful professional books. If we think about like literature and so on, it's all there. If you want to dig into the specificity of Russian imperialism, I would start like historically, that would be Serhiy Plokhy, The Lost Kingdom. Serhiy Plokhy is an acclaimed Ukrainian historian who up till recently was the director of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University and a prolific writer. And one of his books is exactly about the beginnings, the inception of the Russian imperial project, how it came into being and how it was devised, because we tend to like to take certain things as natural, as eternal, as if they have always been there. But going back to the roots and to see like the beginning of those events are very insightful. If you are more interested not in the historical but like in the political science perspective, I do like the very recent book that was released this year by an Irish professor of political science, Donacha O'Bohane. I'm not sure if my Irish pronunciation is perfect. He talks about unfinished empire, and it is called Unfinished Empire, and it is about this ongoing Russian imperialism. If you're interested about the cultural dimension, again, there is this wonderful recent book by an art historian and curator, Svetlana Bedareva, which is called MB Coloniality and War. And she invents a new notion for Russian-Ukrainian colonial relations, and she talks about ambiguity of colonialism and this as a two-way street, how Ukrainian culture and political elites enforce the Russian ones and vice versa, and how it mirrored in the artistic domain. So you might want to look into that. If you're interested in a sociological perspective, I would think about Mikhailo Vinnytsky, Ukraine's Maidan, Russia's War, a chronicle of Ukrainian revolution that fantastically shows what is specific about the Ukrainian society, why it is not a small copy of the Russian one, and how differently, like different patterns and structures are enacted them that made political uprising successful, but also wartime resistance successful. For those who want to understand the structural difference, I think it's like a must go to. And finally, if you're interested in podcasts, I would recommend Volodymyr Yermolenko explaining Ukraine. He has a fantastic lineup of speakers, but also Katerina Humenyuk and Angelina Karyakina, When Everything Matters. So again, they are very complementary to each other, but they give very important insights from within Ukraine, but also in dialogue with external observers.
And the
That would be
question,
it.
and thank you. I will try to find everything you mentioned and to leave the links below in the description under this video. And the question I ask all my guests, why do you love Ukraine?
It's simple. It's simple and complicated at the same time. Being a Ukrainian, it's almost natural. But I can name the turning point when I started being proud of being Ukrainian, and that was related to the Maidan. That was the moment when I thought like, wow, because if we talk about the imperial legacies, it's very much about interiorized inferiority. So you are trained to think of yourself as being less than. And then suddenly you have some good reasons to be proud of your heritage, and sort of you rediscover what being Ukrainian means. And that was fascinating on a human level. I'm not talking as a scholar now, but simply as a person, as a citizen. That was like really fascinating for me, and that changed my life track significantly ever since. And then academically, this is a fascinating place as a scholar where you can test the existing theories and find inspiration for imagining new theories. And such historic moments are rare, and it is so productive for academic creativity, for scholarly research, that I couldn't help but love it with all my heart.
Thank you, Valeriya. Thank you so much. And I hope
Thank you.
you have inspired many of our viewers. And please keep inspiring young people and sort of you. I think it's one of the best thing and treasures of Ukraine to have people like you. And, so like enforcing this, spreading this culture, this, the spirit of Ukraine, basically.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for watching. That was Valeriya Korablyova from Prague, Czechia, and we discussed Russian imperialism and its aspect and how Putin invading Ukraine, demonstrating his aggression, killing Ukrainians daily, children, civilians, soldiers. But at the same time, he's enforcing this internal and external Ukrainian decolonization or um, Ukrainian freedom from Russian influence and post-Soviet leftovers and everything else. I leave all the books and authors Valeria mentioned in our interview in the links in the description under this video. If you're interested, please check it out and let me know what you think. Would you agree? Would you disagree? Or shall we just agree to disagree? Thank you for watching. I'm Jenny Glochko. Have a lovely day.